I sat at that mahogany conference table, my hands flat on the cold wood, staring at my soon-to-be ex-husband and my half-sister. Madison was wearing a cream-colored maternity dress, her hand resting heavily on her bloated stomach. With her other hand, she casually slid a crumpled $100 bill across the table toward me. "Take it," she smirked, flashing the sapphire family ring that used to be mine. "I'll take better care of Ethan anyway, since I can actually give him a family." My stepmother, Elaine, grinned like she'd just won the lottery, while my father stared at the floor in silence. They thought they had broken me. They thought stealing my marriage and using a pregnancy to clear out my life savings would leave me with nothing. But what they didn't know was that the little cottage my mother left behind held a secret that would put both of them in federal handcuffs before the month was over. Welcome to Her Dignity Stories. Before I tell you how I turned their little victory party into a total legal execution, do me a quick favor. Tell me where you're hearing from. If you've ever had to deal with a toxic family that tried to ruin your life, trust me, you'll want to hear exactly how I made them pay for every single lie. My name is Claire, and I'm 34 years old. 6 years ago, I didn't see any of this coming. I was just a freelance graphic designer trying to make rent in Asheville. Then I met Ethan Walker at a local business mixer downtown. He was charming, down to earth, and desperately needed help branding his family's craft brewery. I poured 3 years of my life into that place. I designed the logos, the beer cans, and the taproom menus from my kitchen table. I spent long nights smelling the heavy, sour scent of fermenting yeast. I watched the giant stainless steel brewing tanks get installed one by one. We fell in love between delivery trucks and invoices. When Ethan proposed, it felt like a real partnership. We had a small wedding in the brewery garden with about 30 people. Ethan's grandmother, Evelyn, gave us her blessing. She was the matriarch of the Walker family and held all the money. Evelyn smiled at me and patted my hand that day, but she also whispered that she couldn't wait for a boy to carry on the Walker name. That was the first seed of the nightmare. A year after the wedding, I got pregnant. We bought a crib, painted the spare bedroom light blue, and picked out names at 11 weeks. I started spotting on a Tuesday morning while checking inventory. The doctor at the clinic told us there was no heartbeat. I sat on the paper-covered exam table and felt my world go completely dark. Ethan held my hand in the car, but he didn't say a word on the drive home. 6 months later, it happened again. This time at 9 weeks. I remember lying on the cold tile floor of our bathroom, clutching my stomach and sobbing until my throat was raw. Ethan was down in the kitchen, washing a coffee mug over and over. He didn't come upstairs to hold me. The grief became a physical wall between us in our own house. Then came the IVF treatments. That is a special kind of hell that drains your bank account and your soul. My daily routine became hormone injections, bruises on my stomach, and constant blood draws. I felt bloated, exhausted, and completely hollow inside. When the doctor called to say the embryo didn't take, I didn't even cry. I just sat on the edge of the bed and felt numb. That was when Ethan started staying late at the brewery. He stopped coming home for dinner. He said the expansion was taking up all his time, but I knew the real reason. He couldn't stand looking at a wife who couldn't give him what his family demanded. But Evelyn was calling his phone every single week, asking about the legacy. Ethan was a weak man, and the pressure was breaking him. I felt completely isolated in that big house. My friends stopped calling because they didn't know what to say to a woman who kept losing babies. I started going to a grief support group at a local church on Thursday nights. The counselor gave me a list of specialized psychological appointments for couples dealing with trauma. I knew Ethan and I needed professional help before our marriage completely fell apart. I emailed the schedule and the appointment links to Ethan's private email address. I asked him to pick a slot so we could go together. He never replied. When I asked him about it at breakfast, he looked confused and said he never received anything from me. I thought it was just a glitch in the server, so I sent the emails again, 3 more times over the next month. Still, nothing but silence from him. One night, while Ethan was asleep, his phone kept buzzing on the nightstand with work alerts. I picked it up to turn off the sound so he could sleep. I decided to look at his email app to see if my messages were actually going through. I searched my name. My blood ran cold. Every single email I had sent about the counseling appointments was sitting in his spam folder. They hadn't just accidentally landed there. A specific block rule had been set up on his device to filter out any emails containing the word appointment or counseling from my address. I knew Ethan didn't know how to set up advanced email filters. He could barely manage his spreadsheets. Then I saw the date the filter was created. It was a Sunday afternoon, 3 months ago, during a family barbecue at our house. Ethan had been out by the grill the entire time, but my stepmother, Elaine, had stayed inside, claiming she needed to mew on Ethan's phone to check a contact number for a local food vendor. She had sat on our living room couch with his phone for 20 minutes. That was the moment I realized the trap was already set. Elaine didn't just want me to be sad. She was actively working to make sure my husband thought I was abandoning him in the dark. I walked into my own kitchen on a rainy Tuesday evening and smelled garlic and rosemary, but I hadn't cooked dinner. On my quartz countertop sat 4 oversized Tupperware containers with handwritten labels. Ethan's favorite ribs, Love, Madison. The messy ink read, My favorite vase. The one where I used to keep fresh white magnolias from our backyard was pushed into the dark corner behind the espresso machine. In its place was a tacky, bright orange dish towel that didn't belong to me. Madison was slowly erasing my presence from my own home, one plastic container at a time. Ever since my IVF treatment failed, my stepmother, Elaine, had been dropping Madison off at Ethan's brewery. Elaine knew exactly when to strike. She saw that I was physically and emotionally drained, spending my days in bed with the blinds closed. So she pushed her own daughter into the empty spaces of my marriage. Madison began showing up at the tap room around 5 p.m. every day with homemade lunches and hot soups. Ethan was working 12-hour shifts, trying to avoid me and the heavy silence in our house. He was starving for comfort, and Madison made sure she was the one feeding him. She didn't stop at the brewery. She volunteered to drive across town to help care for Ethan's grandmother, Evelyn, who was battling early-stage dementia. Madison became the perfect, submissive angel in everyone's eyes. Whenever Ethan brought her name up at breakfast, my stomach twisted into tight knots. Madison is just trying to help us out, Claire, Ethan said, pouring milk into his cereal without looking at me. She went to see Nana Evelyn yesterday and cleaned her whole living room. She told me she feels so bad for you because you're too depressed to leave the house. That was the gaslighting, delivered through my own husband's mouth. Madison wasn't just bringing him food, she was rewriting his perception of me. She was planting seeds, making Ethan believe I was an icy, selfish woman who was completely obsessed with my past losses. And Ethan, who desperately needed validation and a legacy, was buying every single word. He started looking at me with pity, which quickly turned into cold resentment. I tried to push back and regain control of my life. On Friday, I forced myself to get dressed, put on some makeup, and drive over to Grandma Evelyn's estate. I wanted to bring her favorite blueberry scones from the bakery down the street. I walked up the stone pathway and opened the heavy front door with my spare key. The house was dead silent except for the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Ba Evelyn was sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, staring blankly at the wall. The moment she saw my face, her entire demeanor changed. She gripped the armrests of her chair, her knuckles turning white, and her eyes filled with sudden, intense fear. "Get out of my house!" Evelyn screamed, her voice cracking and trembling with rage. "You don't belong here anymore. Claire, you are a bad omen to the Walker family. You destroy everything you touch, and you will never give us an heir." I froze in the middle of the oriental rug, the bag of warm scones shaking in my hand. Evelyn had loved me like her own daughter for 3 years. She had never spoken a harsh word to me in her life. I looked at her and saw a wild, confused look in her faded eyes. Just an hour before I arrived, Madison had left the house after spending the entire afternoon alone with her. I knew Evelyn's dementia made her vulnerable, but this sudden hatred was too coordinated to be natural. "Nana, it's me, Claire," I said, taking a slow step forward to calm her down. Evelyn grabbed a glass paperweight from the side table and hurled it directly at my feet. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending shards of sharp glass flying across my boots. "Madison told me what you did?" Evelyn shouted, hyperventilating as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "She told me you hate babies and that you want this family to die out. Get out before I call the police on you." I realized I couldn't argue with a confused 80-year-old woman. I backed out of the living room, my heart pounding against my ribs with pure, suppressed fury, but I didn't drive away. I parked my car down the street, waited 20 minutes until Evelyn calmed down, and slipped back inside through the basement door. I needed to know exactly what Madison had done during her afternoon visit. I walked up the back stairs and entered Evelyn's master bathroom. I opened the mirrored medicine cabinet where the nurse kept her daily prescriptions organized in plastic pill organizers. I began checking the labels on the bottles, looking for anything unusual. Behind a container of standard blood pressure medication, my fingers hit a small, amber plastic vial. It didn't have an official pharmacy label from Walgreens or CVS. It just had a white piece of medical tape with the word vitamins written in Elaine's distinct, looping handwriting. I unscrewed the cap and poured the pills into my palm. They weren't vitamins. They were small, round, white tablets with a specific imprint code on the back. I pulled out my phone and quickly searched the chemical code on the medical database. It was a high-dose prescription sedative, a powerful tranquilizer used to treat severe anxiety in adults. In elderly patients with dementia, this specific drug caused intense confusion, extreme paranoia, and high susceptibility to suggestion. Madison wasn't just caring for Evelyn. She and Elaine were actively drugging her to make her pliable. They were altering her brain chemistry so she would believe whatever lies Madison whispered into her ear about me. I took my phone, photographed the hidden bottle from 3 different angles, and pocketed 4 of the white tablets for lab testing. I carefully put the vial back exactly where I found it and closed the cabinet door. My hands were shaking, but my mind was completely clear. They thought they were playing a clever game of psychological warfare against a broken woman, but they had just crossed the line into elder abuse and criminal poisoning. I walked out of that house knowing that my marriage was already dead. But the war had officially begun, and I was the one holding the evidence. The heavy crystal chandeliers in the Walker Estate ballroom were blindingly bright. Waiters in starched white uniforms glided through the crowd of 80 guests. The air smelled of prime rib, expensive perfume, and total, suffocating hypocrisy. I stood near the catering table, clutching a glass of club soda until my fingers ached. Everyone was clinking their champagne flutes and laughing at jokes I didn't care about. Ethan was standing near the grand piano, talking to a group of his brewery investors. He wouldn't look at me. He hadn't looked at me all evening. Suddenly, my stepmother, Elaine, tapped her silver fork against her wineglass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the jazz music and silenced the room. Elaine smiled, her eyes locked dead on me. Before she gestured to Madison, Madison stepped forward into the center of the room, wearing a tight silk dress. "We have a miracle to share with everyone tonight," Madison announced into the microphone. "I am 3 months pregnant with Ethan's baby, and it's a boy." The room erupted into loud cheers and frantic applause. Ethan stood frozen for a second. Then a massive, rehearsed smile broke across his hawk-hack face. He walked over, wrapped his arm around Madison's waist, and kissed her cheek. I felt the room tilt beneath my stiletto heels. The physical sensation of their ultimate betrayal hit me like a runaway freight train. Elaine didn't let the applause die down before she took the microphone. "We need to protect the honor of this unborn child," Elaine said, her voice echoing coldly. "Ethan cannot raise the heir to the Walker dynasty while tied to a broken marriage." She turned to Ethan and gave him a sharp, commanding nod. Ethan's hands were shaking violently as he reached into his tuxedo jacket pocket. He walked across the polished marble floor toward me, pulling out a thick white envelope. He stopped 2 feet away and thrust the single-party divorce petition into my hands. "I'm sorry, Claire," Ethan muttered, his voice reedy and weak. "Just sign it so we can move on." I looked at my father, Richard, who was standing right next to Elaine. He was my own flesh and blood. He knew about my 2 setae and the agony of my failed IVF treatments, but he just stood there with his hands in his pockets, staring at his shoes in absolute silence. He didn't say one single word to protect his daughter from this public execution. The extended family and the cousins started whispering, throwing pitied, disgusted glances in my direction. "She's just a selfish Vosen failure anyway," I heard an aunt mutter from behind her napkin. Madison pulled out her smartphone, held it high, and started a live video stream for her followers. She positioned her hand perfectly so the camera caught the sapphire family ring on her finger, the exact same ring that Ethan had slipped onto my finger 3 years ago. She smiled into the lens and captioned the post, "Some things belong to those who are actually worthy." The sheer, breathless absurdity of her tro-trend digital provocation was the exact breaking point. The invisible string of my lifelong compliance and non-nin completely snapped inside me. My face went completely blank, my heart rate dropping into a cold, terrifying calm. I took the silver pen from Ethan's shaking hand and signed the papers right there on the catering table. I didn't cry a single tear, and I didn't throw an angry, dramatic tantrum. "You can keep each other," I said, my voice clear enough for the entire front row to hear. I turned my back on the Blackwell and Walker families and walked toward the heavy front doors. It was pouring rain outside, the dark highway slick with black ice. As I reached the threshold to call a ride share, my childhood friend Rachel caught my arm. Rachel was a senior labor and delivery nurse at the Asheville Regional Hospital. She pulled me into the shadow of the entryway pillars, her face etched with deep professional focus. "Claire, don't break down yet," Rachel whispered, her eyes darting back to the ballroom. "I've spent 10 years watching thousands of pregnant women stand up and sit down. The way Madison holds her hips and shifts her weight when she stands is completely wrong. A woman who is truly 12 weeks pregnant doesn't move her lower back like that. She is faking it. Claire, something is completely, documentably twisted about this pregnancy." I looked out at the pouring rain, feeling the cold air fill my lungs with absolute freedom. They thought they had chewed out my dignity and Chonvoy, my future to build their new empire. But they had just blindly walked into a trap of their own overwhelming greed. I got into the car, looked back at the glowing windows of the mansion, and smiled into the dark. They wanted a war, and they were about to discover exactly who they were messing with. My new apartment was a cramped, 44-unit complex on the bleak outskirts of Asheville. The walls were painted a cheap, flat beige that smelled like fresh primer and old carpet. Traffic from the nearby interstate hummed through the thin window panes all night long. I didn't unpack my clothes from the cardboard boxes. I didn't care about comfort. I set up my dual-monitor desktop workstation right on the plastic dining table. The glow from the LED screens was the only light in the dark room. My eyes felt heavy, but my mind was clicking with an icy, ruthless focus. I wasn't the grieving, broken woman they left behind in the rain anymore. I was an investigator tracking down a target. The first thing I did on Monday morning was hire Margaret Sullivan. Margaret was a high-profile corporate litigation attorney who charged $400 an hour. She didn't do emotional hand-holding. She sat in her office, drank black coffee, and demanded hard data. If we want to stop the divorce asset freeze, we need leverage. Claire. Margaret told me over the phone. We don't go to court with tears. We go to court with receipts. I took her advice, scrambling for any digital trail I could find. As a graphic designer, my entire career was built on spotting visual inconsistencies and checking hidden metadata. I started looking at the digital footprint of my own family. That was when I remembered our shared family Amazon Prime account. My biological mother had originally set up the account years ago. I was the primary cardholder, and I paid the $139 annual fee every January. But when my father married Elaine, he asked me to keep her and Madison on the plan to save money. I never transitioned them off because it wasn't worth the family argument. I opened a secure browser tab and logged into the account. The standard order history page just showed mundane household purchases. There were dog treats, laundry detergent, and cheap lawn ornaments bought by my father. But I knew Elaine was sneakier than that. I clicked on the account settings and navigated down to the archived orders section. This is the hidden folder where people hide purchases they don't want anyone else to see on the main feed. My breath hitched as the page loaded a long list of digital receipts from the past 4 months. The orders were all placed by Elaine's linked profile using her personal Visa card. The first item was ordered exactly 1 week before Madison's big announcement. It was a medical-grade, high-density silicone prosthetic belly kit. The product description specifically read, Stage Prop, Second Trimester Realism, 3 to 4 month growth weight. It cost $349. 2 weeks later, there was another order. This one was for a third trimester silicone overlay, 6 to 7 month foam extension. They had bought an entire timeline of fake pregnancy bellies. I kept scrolling down the digital paper trail. Elaine had also purchased 3 packs of high-definition 3D ultrasound prop images. The listing clearly stated these were fake medical scans meant for theatrical use and film sets. They even bought bulk orders of adjustable waist maternity dresses with built-in foam padding to falsify her silhouette. They were building a human being out of synthetic rubber and online Target ads. I felt a cold surge of predatory satisfaction wash over me. I didn't scream, and I didn't text Ethan to call him a fool. I took screenshots of every single invoice, downloaded the full transaction history, and saved the delivery tracking numbers. The packages had all been sent directly to Elaine's suburban house, while I was still living with Ethan. I emailed the complete file to Margaret Sullivan at 2 a.m. Margaret called me back at 7 a.m., her voice sharp with a lawyer's killer instinct. "This is beautiful, Claire, but it's still civil fraud," Margaret said. "We need to prove she cannot legally be pregnant to lock this down as a criminal matter." Margaret didn't wait for a formal court date to act. She immediately issued an emergency legal subpoena to the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. The subpoena demanded the release of all medical registry data tied to Madison Reed's Social Security number, because Madison was claiming a state-regulated pregnancy status to alter a legal marriage contract. The state underwriter fast-tracked the request. The official state registry report hit my secure legal portal on Wednesday afternoon. I opened the PDF file while Margaret sat on the speakerphone line. Madison Reed had absolutely zero prenatal care records anywhere in the entire state network. She had never visited an OB/GYN clinic, a sonogram lab, or a hospital maternity ward in years. But the final page of the report held the absolute nuclear bomb. It was a certified surgical discharge summary from the Asheville Regional Medical Center, dated May 14th, 2022. Madison had undergone a bilateral tubal ligation, a complete surgical sterilization. The surgery was an emergency procedure executed after a severe medical complication from a ruptured ectopic cyst. The surgeon's final clinical note was printed in bold black ink. Patient is permanently sterile and physically incapable of natural conception. Madison hadn't just made a mistake or faked a symptom. She was a legally documented, surgically sterile fraud who couldn't have a child if her life depended on it. I leaned back in my plastic office chair and stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. They thought they could use my deepest trauma, the miscarriages I had suffered, to run a cheap financial scam and steal my life. But they had left their bloody fingerprints all over the internet. I closed my laptop, picked up my purse, and walked out into the crisp autumn air. The trap was officially locked, and I was about to drop the hammer. I drove 30 minutes out of Asheville to a small, quiet house in Black Mountain. The driveway was gravel, lined with overgrown weeds and dying hydrangeas. Susan Harper was waiting for me on her front porch with a mug of chamomile tea. She was my mother's best friend from college and still wore her silver hair in a long braid. Susan didn't say a word when she saw my tired face. She just reached into her linen apron pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key, along with the key. She handed me a faded blue velvet box. "Your mother gave me these 6 years ago, right before the cancer took her," Susan said softly. "She told me to hold on to them until you had completely run out of options. She knew what Elaine and your father were capable of." Claire. I opened the velvet box under the dim porch light. Inside was a stunning antique sapphire brooch shaped like a magnolia blossom. The deep blue stones caught the afternoon sun, burning with a cold, familiar fire. I thanked Susan, took the brass key, and drove deeper into the mountains. My mother's old cottage was hidden at the end of a dirt road, buried under massive magnolia trees. The air up there smelled like damp earth, pine needles, and total isolation. I unlocked the rusted padlock and pushed the heavy oak door open. Dust danced in the streaks of light cutting through the grimy windows. The living room was exactly as she left it, with white sheets covering the old furniture. I walked straight to the stone fireplace, just like Susan told me to. I lifted the third loose brick from the hearth and reached my hand into the dark cavity. My fingers hit cold metal. I pulled out a heavy, olive green steel lockbox. I used the small key attached to the sapphire brooch to pop the lock open. Inside was a thick stack of financial ledgers and a handwritten will. My mother's neat. Sharp cursive covered the yellowed pages of the notebook. It was a forensic record of her personal inheritance fund from my grandfather. The bank statements proved my father and Elaine had been illegally siphoning her money for years. They had frozen my legal access to the trust by forging my signature on estate waivers. Elaine's designer clothes and Madison's sports car were funded by my stolen heritage. A small, folded note slipped out from between the legal pages. "Claire, the truth is like a magnolia blossom," my mother wrote. "It needs the freezing winter to grow, but when it blooms, it outlasts the storm. Don't fight them until you hold the foundation." I dug deeper into the bottom of the lockbox and found a certified property appraisal. That was when the first major realization hit me. The sapphire ring Madison was flaunting on her live streams wasn't the real family heirloom. My father had secretly commissioned a cheap glass replica years ago to trick Ethan's grandmother, Evelyn. He had pawned the real stones to cover Elaine's credit card debts before they met the Walkers. But my mother had found out, bought the original sapphires back from the broker, and rebuilt them. The real priceless family sapphires were right here, embedded in the magnolia brooch in my pocket. Madison was running around Asheville bragging about a piece of worthless blue glass. But the final page of my mother's handwritten will held the absolute nuclear twist. The land underneath Ethan's family brewery didn't belong to the Walker dynasty. My mother's family had leased that commercial lot to Ethan's grandfather back in 1994. The contract had a strict, ironclad clause built into the deed. If my father ever allowed Elaine to sign any legal paperwork or boundary extensions regarding the Bennett estate, the lease would instantly void. The entire 3-acre commercial property would automatically revert to me within 48 hours. By forcing Ethan to divorce me and trying to secure a home equity loan using that fake quitclaim deed, Elaine had just triggered the clause. They thought they were cutting me out of the family business and taking my house. but they were actively signing the eviction notice for their own multi-million-dollar brewery. I packed the lockbox into my car trunk and locked the cottage door. I looked up at the mountains, the wind rustling the heavy magnolia leaves above me. My father and Elaine had spent 12 years trying to make me feel small and powerless, but my mother had mapped out their destruction from beyond the grave. I got back on the interstate, called Margaret Sullivan, and told her I had the match. We were going to burn their entire house of cards down to the ground. Ethan sat alone in his office at the Walker Brewery at 11 p.m. The neon open sign outside flickered, casting a sickly green light over stacks of past-due invoices. The warehouse downstairs was dead silent, a contrast to the roaring machinery he used to manage. He ran his trembling hands over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his hawk-hack cheeks. The silence in his office was thick, heavy with a creeping paranoia. For the past 3 weeks, Madison had been acting completely strange at home. Every time Ethan tried to hug her or touch her stomach, she flinched and pushed him away. She blamed it on severe morning sickness and extreme fatigue. She refused to let him drive her to the OB/GYN clinic for her weekly checkups. She claimed she preferred privacy during her medical appointments, even in their house. She locked the bathroom door every single time she changed her clothes. Ethan was a weak man, but he wasn't completely blind. He knew what a real pregnancy looked like from our past years together. He began to notice that her morning sickness only happened when he was in the room. The minute he turned his back, she was scrolling on her phone, eating takeout, deeply unsettled. Ethan did something he never thought he would do. He spent $1,500 from his personal account to hire a private investigator. He needed hard proof to quiet the voices in his head. The Tem-22 delivered his first surveillance report on Tuesday afternoon. Ethan opened the manila folder, right there at his desk. The surveillance logs and photographs inside made his heart completely stop beating. Madison Reed had never once entered a hospital or a maternity ward since the divorce. The address she visited every single Thursday morning was a warehouse in the industrial district. It was a rented photo studio that specialized in creating fake social media content. The business offered mock medical backdrops, ultrasound props, and pregnancy sets for internet influencers. Madison was just using the studio to shoot her updates and fool the Walker family. There was no child. There was no boy to carry on the family name. Ethan felt a wave of absolute, sickening wash over his entire body. He realized he had thrown away a 3-year marriage for a woman who was faking a human life. He left the office, walked down to the parking lot, and stood by Madison's silver Porsche. He used his spare key to pop the heavy trunk open, looking for more answers. Hidden beneath a mountain of empty designer shopping bags was a large cardboard box. He opened it and stared at a medical grade silicone fake belly designed for a 4-month growth. Right next to the synthetic rubber belly sat a printed bank transfer receipt. It showed $50,000 moved from the brewery's operating fund to Elaine's private account. His new family was systematically robbing him blind while staging a medical hoax. Now, let me ask you a question. If you were in my shoes, watching this hen-and-hat man realize he ruined his own life because of his greed, would you ever take him back? If you believe a man who betrays his wife deserves to be left in his private hell, comment the number 1 right now. Don't hesitate. Just type 1 if you stand for true justice. Ethan stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over my old contact number. He wanted to dial my number, to crawl back, and to beg for forgiveness. But before he could press the call button, his phone buzzed with an urgent email notification. It was a formal legal notice sent directly from my attorney, Margaret Sullivan. The document stated that the entire 3-acre plot of land underneath his brewery was officially frozen. The state court had issued an emergency injunction due to a severe violation of the Bennett family will. The land was reverting to me, and he had exactly 48 hours to halt all operations. He dropped his phone onto the desk, the glass screen shattering across the wood. He didn't even have the right to beg anymore. The trap had completely closed, and he was left with nothing but the ashes of his own making. Madison stood by the mahogany table, her smirk widening as she waited for me to break. I didn't blink or look away from her eyes. I slowly reached down and picked up the crumpled $100 bill she had slid toward me. I folded it neatly into a tight, precise square and set it flat on the wood. Then I turned my head slightly and nodded once to Margaret Sullivan. Margaret didn't waste a single second. She unclasped her heavy leather briefcase with a sharp, echoing snap. She stood up, her charcoal suit perfectly pressed, commanding the entire room. "Let's look at some actual state records before we sign anything," Margaret said, her voice dropping like ice. She slid the first certified medical document across the polished mahogany table. It landed right in front of Ethan's water glass. "This is the official state health discharge registry for Madison Reed from May 2022, Margaret announced. She underwent a bilateral tubal ligation after a ruptured cyst. She is permanently sterile and cannot naturally conceive a child." The silence that hit the room was absolute and suffocating. Madison's jaw went completely slack, her face draining of every single drop of color. She tried to speak, but only a small, pathetic stutter came out of her mouth. Ethan leaned over the paper, his hawk-hack face turning a sickening shade of gray. He stared at the bold medical stamp, his knuckles turning stark white as his fists clenched. But Margaret wasn't done. She pulled the second file from her briefcase and slid it directly over Madison's paper. "These are the archived Amazon Prime invoices linked to Elaine's personal Visa card," Margaret stated. "The tracking metadata shows 2 orders for high-density silicone prosthetic bellies. They were delivered directly to Elaine's suburban home address." Elaine's fake maternal mask completely shattered into a wild, venomous rage. She lunged across the table, her acrylic nails clawing to grab the invoices. Margaret Sullivan stepped firmly in her path, blocking her with a single, freezing glare. "Don't touch the evidence, Elaine," Margaret warned, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. My father, Richard, who had been sitting in total silence, grabbed the third document from the file. It was a certified forensic ledger of my biological mother's estate bank accounts. He stared at the signature line on the recent withdrawal slips for $50,000. It was Elaine's handwriting, clumsily forging his name to fund Madison's social media studio sets. For the first time in 12 years, the NHU Newark look vanished from my father's face. His chest heaved with a sudden, explosive fury that rattled the water glasses. He stood up violently, his chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. Before Elaine could back away, he swung his hand and slapped her hard across the face. The loud smack echoed through the room in front of the 37 people gathered in the mediation bay. Elaine stumbled back into her seat, sobbing uncontrollably and clutching her reddening cheek. I stood up slowly from the head of the table, my emerald suit unyielding and sharp. I reached into my blazer pocket and unpinned my mother's antique sapphire brooch. The real family sapphires burned with a deep, blue brilliance under the lights. I placed the heavy brooch flat on the table, right next to the cheap glass ring on Madison's hand. "You wanted my life so badly, Madison," I said, my voice dropping into a chilling whisper. "You were willing to wear a piece of worthless blue glass and a rubber belly from Amazon just to play the part." Madison looked down at her fake stomach, hyperventilating as the panic attack fully consumed her. Ethan dropped his head into his hands, weeping openly from the utter NUCNAA of his choices. Elaine was hyperventilating, staring at the financial ledgers that proved her identity theft. They had spent years making me feel invisible, treating my pain like a family joke, but they had just signed their own professional and legal execution papers on my terms. I turned my back on their weeping and walked out the door with my head held high. The glass doors of the county courthouse rattled as Elaine marched out with 3 lawyers. She wasn't hiding her face or running from the shame of the mediation room. She had already hired a boutique crisis public relations firm from Charlotte. By 4 p.m. that Thursday, her legal team filed a counter lawsuit against me. They sued me for $500,000 for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They claimed I used illegal corporate espionage to pull altered, private medical data. Elaine stood on the courthouse steps and spoke directly into a local reporter's microphone. My daughter Madison is a vulnerable young mother being terrorized by a bitter woman. Elaine sobbed into the camera. Then Madison took the war to social media. At 7 p.m., my phone started vibrating continuously on my kitchen counter. Madison went live on Facebook and Instagram from her bedroom. She was sitting on her glider chair, wearing an oversized, soft pink cardigan. Her silicone prosthetic belly was now swapped out for a massive, 6-month size shape. She rested both of her hands on the rubber bump, rubbing it slowly for the camera. I am forced to defend my unborn son from pure, evil hatred tonight. Madison wept into her phone screen. Real heavy tears smeared her mascara as she pulled up a fake printed paper. My stepsister Claire couldn't bear the fact that Ethan chose me. She whispered hoarsely to her viewers. She suffered miscarriages, and now she is punishing my baby for her own physical failures. She forged a medical report to claim I am sterile just to get out of her divorce settlement. The comment section on the live feed exploded with immediate, toxic fury. Thousands of local suburban housewives began tagging my design business page. You are a heartless monster. Claire? One comment read, boycott Bennett Design Group immediately. Another user posted on the Asheville community board. The digital assault crossed over into my actual physical livelihood by Friday morning. I sat at my desk and watched my corporate email inbox fill with formal cancellation notices. The lead broker for the Blue Ridge Luxury Estates Group called me at 10 a.m. Claire, the optics are absolutely disastrous for our brand right now, he said, sounding deeply stressed. We have local moms threatening to picket our open houses because of your family drama. We are suspending your staging contracts for the North Asheville development effective immediately. 3 other major real estate developers pulled their listings from my schedule before noon. Elaine's media mudslinging was working with terrifying, brutal efficiency. My business page rating dropped to 1.2 stars within 6 hours. People who had never even been to Asheville were calling my office phone, screaming profanities at my assistant. A group of 10 local women actually gathered on the sidewalk outside my flagship studio. They held up crude cardboard signs that read, "Justice for Baby Walker" and "Stop Corporate Harassment." They shouted at my delivery drivers, forcing them to turn the trucks around. My father text messaged me, saying I brought this shame on myself by not just writing Elaine a check. Ethan didn't call, but he changed his Facebook profile picture back to a photo of him and Madison. The pressure was suffocating, closing in on me from every single angle. Elaine sent a smug text to my private number. The settlement demand is now $2 million. Claire, pay it, or we take your business next. I didn't reply to her text. I didn't post a statement on my company page. I didn't go live to defend my character or explain my say-tie trauma to strangers. My friend Rachel begged me to do something to stop the bleeding, but I told her to hold the line. I stayed holed up in my office for 48 hours, drinking stale coffee and working with Margaret Sullivan. We maintained an absolute, ironclad communication blackout. Elaine and Madison believed my silence was a sign of total financial panic. They thought the public boycott had broken my spirit and that I was scrambling to gather their extortion money. But we weren't panicked. We were just waiting on the clock. Margaret had submitted an emergency motion to a state federal judge for a digital forensics trick-shot order. The mandate forced Apple and Verizon to release the complete cloud backup logs for Elaine's private phone number. We weren't interested in her public statements or her lawyer's press releases. We wanted the raw, unedited data from her personal text message server. At 11:30 p.m. on Friday night, The encrypted data dump finally cleared our legal terminal. Margaret Sullivan loaded the Koi Fulisay data logs onto the main monitor screen. Over 200 deleted iMessages from Elaine's iCloud account appeared in neat, chronological rows. I leaned into the blue light of the screen, looking at the exact text timeline. The oldest message was dated 3 months ago, sent from Elaine to Madison at 2:14 p.m. Ethan is complaining about Claire's medical bills again, Elaine had written to her daughter. The fool is desperate for a son, so it's time to put the rubber belly to work. The con was documentably captured in black and white text. I looked at Margaret, and her sharp, professional face broke into a cold, predatory smile. The con artists were celebrating their internet victory on television, but they had just left the digital keys to their own prison cell, right in my hands. The public gallery of the Asheville courtroom was packed to maximum capacity. Reporters from local news stations adjusted their microphones near the wooden benches. The Walker family investors sat in the front row, whispering furiously while looking at their tablets. The heavy air smelled of cheap courthouse coffee and nervous sweat. I sat at the witness stand wearing my sharpest black power suit. My face was completely calm, frozen like a block of mountain ice. Across the room, Elaine sat next to her defense team, smoothing her beige cardigan. Her lawyer stood up confidently and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client is a victim of a vicious digital smear campaign," he announced loudly. "Claire Bennett has fabricated medical records to destroy an innocent young mother's reputation." Madison nodded along from the defense table, holding her large rubber stomach and wiping a fake tear. They honestly thought their dirty public relations scheme had worked. They thought public opinion would bully the judge just like it bullied my design business. Then my attorney, Margaret Sullivan, stood up from our table. She didn't reach for a thick stack of printed legal briefs. She walked calmly to the center aisle, holding a small silver USB drive. She plugged it directly into the court's main digital presentation terminal. The massive projector screen on the wall flickered and came to life. "We aren't presenting opinions today," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the room. "We are presenting the raw data logs from Elaine's private cloud backup server." A certified digital forensics report appeared on the screen in stark black text. It held over 200 deleted iMessages recovered by a federal court order. The judge pressed a button, and the courtroom's automated text-to-speech system began reading the logs aloud. The artificial voice sounded flat, mechanical, and terrifyingly clear. "Make sure Madison puts on the 5-month belly overlay this week." Elaine's text read, "Secretly slip the sedative pills into old Evelyn's tea so the old woman stays confused and hates Claire. We must corner that B***titch Claire into a financial corner so Ethan signs the single-party divorce immediately." The entire room erupted into absolute, breathless shock. Reporters started typing frantically on their laptops as the cameras zoomed in on Elaine. Now, imagine sitting in that room, watching a mother and daughter get caught red-handed in a massive federal lie. If you think these two parasites are finally getting exactly what they deserve, type the word guilty in the comments right now. The automated voice kept reading, dropping the first major knot of the evening. The log showed a series of wire transfers totaling $50,000. The cash had been wired to Elaine from a shell corporation owned by the Blue Ridge Brewing Company. They were the primary market rival of Ethan's family business. Elaine had taken a bribe from his competitors to ensure the Walker Brewery land lease collapsed during the divorce. She was planning to destroy Ethan's entire family legacy for her own private profit. Ethan's face turned completely white as he looked at Madison and Elaine. He shook his head in pure disbelief, realizing his new family had used him as a brainless pawn. Before Elaine's lawyers could even formulate an objection, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom flew open. 4 federal special agents from the Financial Fraud Division walked down the center aisle. They didn't wait for the judge to recess the hearing. The lead agent walked straight to the defense table and pulled out 2 pairs of steel handcuffs. "Elaine Reed and Madison Reed, you are under arrest," the agent announced loudly. "You are being charged with federal bank fraud, wire extortion, and elder abuse." Madison began screaming hysterically, trying to block the cameras as the cold steel clicked around her wrists. Elaine collapsed against her lawyer, sobbing uncontrollably as she was forced out of her seat. The reporters rushed toward the aisle, their camera flashes exploding continuously. Ethan stood up from his chair, his knees buckling completely as the reality hit him. He fell to his knees right on the carpeted floor in front of my witness stand. Tears streamed down his haggard face as he reached out to grab the hem of my trousers. "Claire, please, I didn't know," Ethan wailed, his voice cracking pathetically. "They set me up. They lied to me about the baby. Please withdraw the land freeze or the brewery is dead. I'm your husband, Claire. Please save me." I looked down at his trembling hands, feeling absolutely zero pity or emotion inside my chest. I stood up, stepped back to avoid his touch, and picked up my leather portfolio. I walked straight past his kneeling form, completely ignoring his frantic begging. The sharp stiletto heel of my boots clicked heavily against the hardwood floor. It sounded exactly like a final, unyielding legal judgment echoing through the room. They wanted to use my pain to build an empire of lies, but they had just executed themselves on my stage. 6 months after the federal trial, the dust finally settled over Asheville. The court judgments were carried out with absolute, ruthless efficiency. Madison was sentenced to 36 months in a low-security federal facility. Her conviction for medical fraud, identity theft, and wire extortion destroyed her entire life. The glamorous hot girl persona she cultivated on Instagram vanished completely overnight. Her digital profile was totally blacklisted, leaving nothing but mugshots on Google. Elaine suffered her own specific brand of absolute, devastating ruin. My father filed for an immediate, contested divorce the week after her arrest. The state judge ordered the total confiscation of all her illegally acquired assets. The country club elite in Asheville gallan her like a walking contagion. She had to move into a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom apartment near the interstate. The thin walls vibrated continuously from the deafening roar of semi-trucks. The indoor air always smelled like damp mold, exhaust fumes, and cheap cleaning bleach. To pay off her court-ordered civil restitution, Elaine had to take a job she despised. She worked the graveyard shift as a night janitor for a commercial office park. The woman who used to demand a $100,000 lifestyle was now scrubbing toilets. Ethan's world collapsed just as spectacularly at the Walker Brewery. His grandmother, Evelyn, completely recovered her mental clarity after stopping the sedatives. She immediately called an emergency board meeting with the brewery's primary investors. They officially stripped Ethan of his vice president title and executive authority. A newly appointed board of directors took over the day-to-day operations. Ethan was left as a low-level floor manager, forced to work for a salary he didn't control. He lived in a small, rented room downtown, drowning under his maxed-out credit cards. He spent his evenings drinking cheap beer, watching my design business thrive on the local news. He was entirely consumed by a bitter, impotent regret every single day. On a Tuesday night, Ethan sat on his mattress and stared at his phone. He tried to call my private number using a burner phone he bought at a gas station. He desperately wanted to hear my voice, to apologize, and to ask for a second chance. But the second he hit the dial button, his call was automatically disconnected. A mechanical automated operator message flashed instantly across his screen. "This number has permanently blocked all incoming communications from the Walker estate." He dropped the phone onto the linoleum floor, realizing he was permanently dead to me. The ultimate breakdown of their fabricated wealth happened right on Elaine's street. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Elaine was walking down the sidewalk by the highway. She was wearing a stained tracksuit, carrying 2 heavy black plastic trash bags to the dumpster. Suddenly, a commercial flatbed tow truck pulled up aggressively against the curb. An agent from the auto finance bank jumped out with a clipboard and a set of master keys. He hooked the heavy metal chains directly to the axle of Madison's silver Porsche. The car had been sitting in the apartment lot because the lease payments were 6 months past due. Elaine dropped her trash bags onto the concrete, screaming at the man to stop. "That is my daughter's car. You can't touch it," she shrieked, her voice cracking in the wind. The repo agent didn't even look at her as he hoisted the luxury SUV onto the flatbed. "Tell your daughter to pay her bills," he muttered, slamming his truck door shut. The neighbors watched from their balconies as the silver Porsche was dragged away into the dust. It was the absolute, crystalline encapsulation of their ruin, fraudulent life. They had destroyed my marriage and stolen my money to buy a temporary illusion of luxury. Now they were trapped in 1,000 square feet of cheap carpet and thin walls. I didn't visit their apartment, and I didn't send them a single text message. Their punishment was the miserable reality they were now forced to face every morning. I was finally completely free of their toxic entitlement, and the future was entirely mine. I stood on the sun-drenched cedar balcony of my mother's old cottage in Black Mountain. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of damp pine needles and blooming white magnolias. I took a slow, appreciative sip of my dark roast coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest. The old property had completely transformed over the last 2 years. I used my restored inheritance to remodel the structure, adding large floor-to-ceiling glass panels that faced the mountains. My land was now the official home of the Magnolia House. It was a boutique sanctuary and private shelter for American women who had been financially exploited by their own families. I helped them secure top-tier corporate attorneys and rebuild their credit profiles from scratch. I had completely recovered every single dollar from the Bennett Family Trust Fund. I even packed that cheap glass replica ring into a padded envelope and mailed it back to the Walker estate. I attached a small sticky note inside the box that read, "The Bennett family does not hoard garbage." I was fully financially independent, intensely successful, and completely free from their toxic dynamic. As I looked down toward the gravel highway at the edge of my property, a sputtering sound caught my ear. A beat-up, faded Ford pickup truck with a dented bumper crawled slowly past my security gates. The driver's side window was rolled down completely. Through the dusty glass, I saw a familiar hawk hack profile. It was Ethan. He was wearing dirty, mud-stained Kong-Nan overalls and a faded baseball cap. He tapped his brakes, slowing the truck down to a crawl as he stared up at my Ruck Row estate. His eyes were wide, filled with a bitter, impotent regret, as he looked at the life he had thrown away. I didn't wave, and I didn't smile. I just watched him hit the gas pedal, his loud exhaust pipe kicking up a thick cloud of road dust as he vanished. He was stuck driving an unwashed work truck while I owned the very ground beneath his wheels. I walked back inside the warm living room. Stepping onto the clean hardwood floor, I looked at the framed photograph of my mother resting on the oak shelf and smiled. "You were right, Mom," I said quietly to the quiet room. The truth needed a freezing winter to solidify, but when the magnolias bloom, no lie can chanvoy, them vien. True value is never simply inherited from a toxic legacy. It is fought for and dug out of the ground. Shared DNA is never a legal license for financial abuse, and a marriage certificate is not an ATM card. If you are currently sitting at a table where people expect you to shrink just to keep them warm, it is time to flip the table. Your hard-earned peace of mind and your retirement savings belong exclusively to you, not to a parasite. Please hit that like button and subscribe right now if you stand with me against toxic family manipulation. Share your own stories of setting hard boundaries in the comment section below so we can keep building this community. Don't go away just yet. because there are more incredible videos waiting for you right on this channel. Click on the next video link on your screen to see how another brave soul turned their deepest betrayal into absolute triumph. In our upcoming story, I am going to reveal a shocking new case involving a corporate revenge plot that you won't want to miss. Stay tuned. Keep your assets locked tight, and I will see you in the next video.